I don't think it takes any much intuition to realize that we're living in very unpredictable times. You know, since I've come here to this country, which is actually a week ago today, we left California, but it took us 24 hours to get here, and a day and a half by the calendar. I've been learning about the particular way in which uncertainty is expressing itself in the place where we are now. But it's really not that different anywhere. We are living in times in which there's a great deal of confusion. I don't know whether Joseph Campbell's wonderful work has come down into this country as much as it has in America. His study in life was about myths and stories. He's passed away now, and he did a series of recordings and interviews in the last years of his life. And it was all about how cultures are formed and how the arts, really, but he was concentrating mostly on music and story, about how that defines, how people understand who they're supposed to be, what their morality is supposed to be, what it means to be a human being, what a righteous life looks like. A great deal of it is conveyed, not so much by philosophy as by story. In his book, Autobiography of a Yogi, Yogananda talks about how his mother judiciously drew on the example of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, primarily to give him moral instruction when he strayed. And so his understanding of how he was supposed to behave was based on Arjuna and the Pandavas and Rama and Sita and so on. I remember when I first was traveling in India, and the man who was our guide, who was the first Indian friend I had, he began to talk to me, and he would illustrate the points that he would make by referring to the myths, by what happened to this deity and to that deity. He was a highly educated, extremely westernized Indian, and yet he would present these facts as being so compelling, because after all, this is what Brahma and Saraswati did, and this is what Lord Shiva did. And I remember at the time just appreciating it, because I was not ignorant of what he was talking about. But it's been many years before I fully understood sort of how much the way we idealize is how we really understand and how we aspire. Now, Joseph Campbell's stories were all from traditional cultures, from ancient times, from all kinds of other things. And the interviewer finally said to him, because there were no stories from our modern era, and he said, well, what happens when a culture has no story? And he sort of looked out the window and he said, this. And that fact has always stayed in my mind, that this, I mean, not this, because this is beautiful, but what lies beyond the boundaries of this, and what lies in many countries where we don't have even a clear picture of what human life is about, what to speak of an elevated picture of it. And in fact, if we look at the stories of our times, it's video games, it's movies, it's novels, it's music, and of course it's Netflix and all the other ways. And how rare in all of those fields is it to find something that is truly idealistic, that is uplifting, and that also has the magnificence to really capture the human imagination. So by any standard, any historical standard, basically we are watching a disintegrating civilization. And it's not just one country after another, it's global. It's just, we are in a time, and Yogananda talks about it in his autobiography, in terms of these great cycles on planet Earth of ascending and descending ages. We're in a rising age, because that's self-evident, if for no other reason, because of the the capacity gradually to unify the globe and to destroy the limitations, first of space and gradually of time. Because here I am, we came way around on the globe, and it took us 24 hours of travel, but it just took us 24 hours of travel. And yesterday morning, I was having a chat with my housemate back in California, and in perfectly real time, even though we're thousands of miles away from each other. You know, I was chatting to him, he was telling me, you know, what he was having for breakfast, and, you know, what I was talking about the same thing in essence. So that the limitations of the past are dissolving in front of our eyes, and this is a sign of a rising age, but we're also in a very tumultuous transition. And the difference between the past and the present is the past was about matter, and matter is a fixed reality. It just is what it is. And what we're moving into is an age of energy. And energy is completely mutable. Energy can take any form at all. So, whereas in the past, the myth of planet Earth, so to speak, the story was of fixed realities. Your race, your country, your language, your religion was separate from mine. And as a consequence, you know, but because space was so fixed and time was so fixed, you could live in Switzerland and you could live in a little valley and you might never leave your valley. You could have a dialect in Italy that only you in your little town spoke. And that was just fine because you never left it. Everything was separate. And Christians certainly didn't associate with Hindus, and Hindus didn't associate with Christians. I'm going to tell you a little story that a friend of mine, apparently at a certain point, I mentioned that I grew up Jewish, but many of my friends grew up Catholic. And if you kind of poke them in a certain way, they'll start reciting the catechism, which they all had to memorize. You're one of them, actually. Yeah. There's 3 or 4 of them, and they can all start talking to each other in this thing that they know. But for a long time, if an unbaptized baby died in the Catholic tradition, the baby went to limbo. And that was neither heaven nor hell. There's certain logical insolubles in a lot of this theology, but nonetheless, intelligent people were committed to the idea that the unbaptized babies went to limbo. At a certain point, because of the rising age, limbo was harder and harder to believe in. You just didn't quite know what to do. So at some point, I think the Pope dissolved it. So then the logical dilemma was, what happened to all those babies who were in limbo all that time? So my friend, who is presently a Kriyaban, but used to be a Lutheran minister, suggested that all the babies were given to the Hindus because then they could reincarnate. In our community, Swami Kriyananda is very, very funny, and we would laugh a lot. And I sometimes have kind of a wit that's a little too sharp. Instead of thinking before I speak, sometimes I just speak. And he asked me some perfectly rational, reasonable question, and I gave a rather cheeky answer to it. And all of a sudden, I got really nervous. I asked him several questions, which some of you might be interested in. First, I said, did you ever tease Yogananda? Because he lived with Yogananda, because he's much older. And so the last 3 years of Yogananda's life, I said, did you ever tease him? He said, oh, no, I was just a new disciple. I was much too nervous. I never would have done that. And I said, did anybody tease him? He said, well, there was one man, Dr. Lewis, and Dr. Lewis was Yogananda's first disciple in America. And Dr. Lewis was, I think they were both 26 years old. They were young men, they were 26. Yogananda was just on the shores of America, nothing of the mystique that grew up around him over time. He was just an interesting, very interesting. And Dr. Lewis knew that he was the guru. He knew what his spiritual state was, but they were just young men together. So he said Dr. Lewis would tease him, even play pranks and things like that. Just a very different relationship, but Swami said he never could. But years later, when Swamiji went to India and met Anandamoyi Ma, the bliss-permeated mother that's talked about in Autobiography of a Yogi, and she lived until 1982. Swamiji he lived in India for 4 years, and he was with her a great deal during that time. He said he had the relationship with Anandamoyi Ma that he was too young to have with Master, is how he put it. So he was completely at ease, and there was a lot of back and forth, in a natural way. But with Master, he said he was always too much in awe. But anyway, I said something very cheeky, which was not the first time I said anything like that. And I sort of said like this, where does humor come from? I mean, is humor a good thing? Swami's answer was interesting. He said, to a certain extent, humor is a spiritual quality. Because in order to make a joke out of something, you have to have enough flexibility in your perception of reality to just turn it into something that is not. This is the place of creativity on the spiritual path. Instead of just seeing things in this straight, unchanging way, you can just flip it all around, like giving the unbaptized babies to the Hindus, which is in every way ridiculous, but you just stand back and see it in a different way. So that's been my justification ever since, which is a good one, I think, for just being free to be ourselves and see things as we see them. Well, coming back into all of this, we're in this period of time in which all of the old stories don't really work for us anymore. We're too rational, we have too much information, we're too scientific, and a lot of the old dogmas, they don't work for us anymore. It's just like when the Pope decides that limbo doesn't exist, even though for all these centuries it's existed, it doesn't, for many of us, increase our faith in the Pope. It makes us wonder about the whole system. And that fixed form, which just held that reality for so long. And it's just the same in India with all the priests and the pujaris. And my same friend said to me, Hinduism is the only religion where you have to pay someone to practice it for you. You have to hire a priest to do whatever it is that you need to have done. Like, why would God require me to hire a priest? Because we're not hypnotized by the form of things anymore. And I was of a generation in the United States. I was sort of in that early wave of hippies where we were all sent off to college with all the great hope that we were going to be the next generation of doctors and lawyers and bankers and businessmen. Instead, we came home with long hair and funny clothes and sometimes a marijuana cigarette in our hand and told our parents we weren't going back to school. It did not go over well, let's just put it that way. But the movement was stronger than anything against it because the form just didn't make any sense to a lot of us anymore. Just didn't make sense. It wasn't that we, even in my own case, it wasn't that I was even repudiating my parents' values because I was fortunate to grow up in a very refined home. But I didn't want the form of what they were doing. I wanted to take all of that social responsibility and ethical and moral teaching, which is characteristic of being raised in a Jewish family, and also the determination to debate anybody who disagrees with you, to hold to your own point of view, because the form of things, with the reality, the energy of things is what mattered. Okay, and that's where we are right now. But what's happening is we don't have any story. We don't have any reliable history that we can look to because we are the cycle on planet Earth of rising and descending ages. The descending completed itself in the year 500 AD. This is according to the way Yogananda and Sri Yukteswar explain it. This is a 24,000-year cycle, 12,000 going down, 12,000 going up. And 500 AD was the nadir, 1700 was the beginning of the change, 1900 was the actual starting point. From 1900 to now, everything's changed. Everything has changed. If you think back what life was like in 1900, people living in rural ways with horses and wagons and And it's had its positive and its negatives. But for me to be standing here would have been impossible at that time, for me to be filming and posting on YouTube. Can you think of anybody in 1900 you could have said YouTube? Like, where would that ever have gone? Now, all of this is the good news and the bad news. It's much more good than bad, but we tend to think as human beings on this planet at this time, we use the word good, and good tends to mean easy and pleasurable. Not for everyone, of course, but good means easy and pleasurable. Even when we talk in terms of karma, good karma, we tend to think of good karma as easy and pleasurable. And we tend to think of bad karma as painful, challenging, disappointing, heartbreaking, even. But we use the word bad. Now, if you stand back from it and really try to think about it, you have to ask different kinds of questions. Like, what is the purpose of life? Where, and even a much more important and deeper question is, what brings true and lasting happiness, and what causes suffering? The pleasure and ease make you happy in the moment, but does pleasure and ease bring true and lasting happiness? There's a test that you can follow, which Jesus put out in the Bible when his disciples said to him, "How can you tell a true from a false prophet?" Which is a very good question. It's the same question anybody would ask today. He said, "By their fruits." He said, a good tree gives good fruit, and a bad tree gives bad fruit. In other words, by the result. And how do you know the result? How do you know whether a fruit is good or bad? You taste it, don't you? You know, it's not like somebody says, this is a good one, this is a bad one. You say, let me taste it. And that's how we're made, is that we learn from our own experience. And sooner or later, we have to learn from our own experience. So we ask the question, what brings lasting happiness? And we have to see the fruit of certain actions. When in those early hippie days, when we were dismantling the moral fabric of our society, especially the sexual revolution, which was a big deal in California where I lived. And Swami Kriyananda was a monk most of his life. He had a period where he was married, but mostly he was a monk. And he represented an extremely orthodox tradition. And even in the very early days of our community, which was like 1970, 71, I remember there was a satsang with Swami, and some visitor challenged him, "What do you think of the sexual revolution?" He said like that. And you would expect an orthodox answer. That would be the normal thing, the normal expectation. Not from Swamiji. He was much too practical for that. He surprised everyone by saying, overall, he said, I think it's a good thing, which was by no means the answer that it's the answer everybody wanted, but not the one they expected, okay? And Swami said, for this reason, he said, people are rejecting dogma and making their own experience the criteria of their values. So that was what he gave it to us first. And he said, so I think it's a good thing, provided you're honest in your analysis of your experience. Because we have such a tendency, the human mind, to see the world according to what we want. We allow our desires to blind us even to our own experience. So the questions that have to be asked is what causes lasting happiness and what causes suffering. I'll just finish with there was, in the U.S., there was, in the hippie heyday of San Francisco, there was a really marvelous man named Stephen Gaskin, and he was just the epitome of a hippie guru. He was about as perfect as he could be. And he did these Monday night classes in San Francisco, and he single-handedly created a lot of what happened in San Francisco. Eventually, he gathered up all his people. They got in a bunch of buses, yellow buses, and they started out across the country to find land to start a community. They ended up 3/4 of the way across in rural Tennessee, and they started something they called the farm. And that was there it's still there. It's changed, but it's still there. And among his many other ideas was group marriage, that you would, because if the form doesn't matter, we're making experience our judge. But after a while, they didn't have that anymore. And I was at a gathering where he was there, and someone said, I understand you've abandoned the idea of group marriage. He said, why don't you have it anymore? And then he sort of argued for the ideal. Stephen, who was an English professor but affected bad grammar to make himself one of the people. Why don't you have it anymore? He said, honey, it don't work. It's like that. It don't work. So they conducted an experiment, and it don't work. What causes lasting happiness? What causes suffering? And many of us have gotten very far into that experiment. Life has either this incarnation or previous incarnations. I was born with this passionate need to understand where happiness comes from, and a very fierce determination not to take anybody's word for it, but to find out. And I was so intent on understanding happiness. And after I met Swami, I said, but sir, this is so ironic because I've never been unhappy. I've always been very cheerful. I've had a wonderful life, but I have this anxiety about knowing the source. And he just said, well, past lives, obviously. This is not the first time we appear on this planet. We all know this. This is the middle of a very, very long story. And even though if you're reading a novel, a chapter book, as little children call it, when they advance to the level of a chapter book, the chapter will end, but the story will just keep going, won't it? Like this. And so chapters end, lives end. We all know that. Some of us know that intensely and painfully, that lives end. But that doesn't mean that life ends, or that our evolution as individual souls ends. Each one just goes like this. But many, many things happen to us that are too deep to resolve in the little bit of space that we have. So we are struck in a very deep way, either with something that pleases us or with something that breaks our heart. So what is the secret of lasting happiness? What is, the true escape from suffering? And so that's what we're trying to understand. And if there's any hope for a better world, it's for all of us who are willing to step outside what everyone else thinks is what we ought to be doing, to conduct the experiment deeply enough to be able to give from our own experience a real answer to that. Revolutions happen one by one, which is a very hard thing to understand. This is a point that I think is very important for us to know. Master teaches us about 3 levels of how things are manifested. Things are manifested first, there's an idea. Look at this beautiful place, this building we're in. It was God's idea to make all of that. But some human being decided to make this. I often walk into buildings or places and I think about, who thought of this? And what did they have to do in order to make this? And who put those beams up there? And who laid this floor? We walk into it and it's already manifested. But it wasn't here at one point, and somebody had an idea. But we have lots of ideas, and not all of them manifest, do they? Wouldn't it be lovely if? But whoever had this idea put energy into that idea. And energy is manpower, energy is persuading others, energy is earning money. Money itself is energy. So first you have an idea, then you put energy into it, and finally it manifests. And this has a a metaphysical counterpart, which is the causal world, which is the world of ideas, the astral world, which is the world of energy, the material world, which is the world of form. But what's so interesting about this, if you think about it, is from the time that whoever had the idea that he was going to build this or she was going to build this, and putting out all that energy, the last stage of that was that this manifested. This was not the first stage, this was the last stage. So everything that is an idea now that energy is being applied to, I mean, this is the future. Because this is, even though this will last for a long time, and the way this building has been used, you all have been here for about 6 years, and there was a whole nother reality before that time. And the fact of your coming here, somebody had an idea, somebody put energy into it, now your presence is manifested. I was part of the founding. I've helped found 2 communities, one rural and one urban. We've helped start an elementary school, which is now 30 years old, where I live in California. And when we were trying to start that school, and we had to, in order to have a school, we had to persuade parents to give us their children for school that wasn't there. And the only way that we could have a school is if they gave their children to a school that wasn't there. And I discovered that parents were reluctant to do that. Parents are very protective of their children, you know. And we were having a meeting in the house where I was living, in the living room of it, and gradually it was dawning on me what the obstacle was here. And I said to them, you know, I see the problem. I said, you're looking at the center of the room where there was just the blank carpet. I said, you see a blank carpet, I see the school. And so to me, the school was there, but to them it looked like a blank carpet because I'd been doing this for a while. I knew what it was to manifest things. I knew how to be an entrepreneur. In fact, I didn't know how to run a school, but I knew how to be an entrepreneur. So I was the admissions director of that school actually for 6 or 7 years until it shifted from being generic entrepreneurship into actually being a school. Oh dear. I mean, we had other educators, thank God, but I went to where Helen was living at that time and threw myself and wept at her feet and persuaded her to come and, you know, take it over because she was an educator. I said, you've got to help me. It's way past me at this point. But they didn't understand causal, astral, material. So this is an extremely important point for all of us. Now, there are 2 sides to asking these questions. You know, what causes happiness, what brings suffering? First of all, it's all about me. You know, what causes me to suffer, what makes me happy? We're not going to be motivated until it's personal. But one of the things that we understand is one of the things that brings us great happiness is to share with others, is not just to gather and hold for myself, but that the process of giving away what I have, it not only is gratifying to see that, but it also, the channel is blessed by that which flows through it. This is one of Yogananda's aphorisms, that in being an instrument of upliftment to others, that's seva, that's selfless service, that's expanding the light, that's gratitude. There are all kinds of ways. So it's very difficult to gather for yourself. One of the things that does not bring lasting happiness is just to gather for ourselves, especially at a time like this, where everything is so uncertain. And what are the answers? One of my friends, I think it was original with her, she said it very simply, you know, the solutions to the future are not in the past, because nothing is the same. You know, everything that was true yesterday even is not true today, and it will really not be true tomorrow. I live in Silicon Valley. Artificial intelligence is the big conversation. You know, what is that going to mean? Because I live where revolutions are happening every day. Jobs are just being completely wiped out. People's lifelong training is becoming obsolete. Some high school dropout is changing the whole course of, you know, technology. So we're not going to find it in the past. We're only going to find it now going forward. And so those of us who are disciples of these great saints, of Master who's come to this world to really take us into something new, is not being given to us just to hoard, which is why we're not off living in caves. In Kali Yuga descending, the good news about being born in such a terrible age is that there's no hope of building anything because the barbarians are going to come in and destroy it anyway. So you just get to gather your little band and you get to really go off somewhere, which sometimes looks real attractive. But that's not where we are. We're integrated into society. We're trying to bring spirituality into daily life. We're trying to show that form is unimportant. It's only the spirit with which you live. And one of the primary rules for happiness is to share, to give what you have. And most of us were born with a deep desire to do that. That was my dilemma before I found the spiritual path, was that I really wanted to help people. I was, generally speaking, as I said, a pretty happy person, and I really could see other people suffering. It's unbearable. You really want to do something, but what can you do? If you're not a bazillionaire, and you can be a philanthropist, but even then, how will that help? So I was like a fanatic without a cause, is actually the way you want to say it. I wanted to give myself without reservation to something, but it had to be something that I believed in. So when I began to understand, which all of us are understanding, that it begins in the human heart. The first time I went to India, which was many years ago, so it was a different country then. And I saw poverty, and I saw overpopulation, and I saw exploitation in a way that it was never visible to me in California. It might have existed, but it wasn't visible. But I looked out the window of the bus, driving through the city of Delhi in the middle of the night, and seeing people living on the sidewalk. We have all the money in the world to fix this. Collectively, globally, we can make this heaven on earth. And the reason it's not heaven on earth is because people don't want to work that hard, and they don't want to work that way, and they don't want to be that unselfish. And so it was clear to me that the problem is the human heart. That's all. And this is what Yogananda writes in his autobiography of a yogi. Jesus and Yogananda together have planned, he writes, and Babaji and Jesus have planned the spiritual salvation of this age. And I love this. They're very concerned about the influence of Western civilization. They think it's really not healthy. You think of Babaji as the deathless master up in the Himalayas. Years ago, when Swami Kriyananda was first in India, and he was too elderly at that point. He was 77 when he started our Ananda in India. His health wasn't good. He didn't really know how he was going to reach people, because when he'd been there in his 30s, he traveled all over the country. But there was television. There were all these dedicated stations to spiritual teaching, and millions of people watched them. So he started doing television programs. He recorded daily television shows, and honestly, he put Yogananda's name on the map in India because millions of people watched Swami Kriyananda on television. Later, this young man is in the mountains, and he has an experience there, and he comes back to the city of Delhi, and he tells Swami Kriyananda that. And I believe this was true. Swamiji presented it to us, and he would know if it was true. This young man said that he met Babaji, the deathless master in the Himalayas, and Babaji sent a message to Swami Kriyananda. Babaji says that he's very pleased with the work that Swami's doing, especially the television shows. Okay, that in itself was marvelous. My brain says, does Babaji know about television? He lives up in the Himalayas. He lives in a cave, Does he know about television? Then I thought, what am I thinking here? Of course he knows about television. He's omnipresent. He knows about everything. But Jesus and Babaji are concerned about what's going on here, because they can see how much people are suffering. And they can see how ineffective the solutions people are choosing actually are? And the answer is quite simply this. This is the answer. This is just standing back from the hypnosis of what everyone is doing. That doesn't, some of us have really moved out of that society, but you don't have to. It's standing back inwardly and realizing that there is a completely other reality here. And I don't have to be afraid. No, death may come, but life cannot die. That my spirit, my soul is here on an assignment. This is a chapter in a book. I have something I'm supposed to do here. And the more deeply I attune myself inwardly, the more I will be able to fulfill my own destiny. And part of my destiny, our destiny, is to take whatever we have that's good and to share it with others. And, hope for a better world is not some big global thing happening. Change does not happen that way. If you read history even a little bit, you see that every major shift, global shift, societal shift, starts with one person who has a good idea. And then they put energy into that idea, and then they draw other people into that idea, and pretty soon you have an American Revolution. Pretty soon you have a sea change in a country. Pretty soon you have Steve Jobs, who just, all by himself, just makes up things that all of us just completely live by now. Just one by one by one. And also it's so important to understand that there's not one of us that is either powerless or unimportant. Because it's an interwoven fabric. If you look at any tapestry, you can't just sort of say, oh, this is just a small thread. I'll just cut it out and pull it out of the tapestry. Every single thread comes together, and eventually you end up with this beautiful picture. And we don't even know what part our thread is playing, because we have the compelling energy of our karma that makes us move, but we don't necessarily have the perspective of where it comes from and where it's going. When I was first knowing Swami Kriyananda, I had tremendous faith in him, just intuitively, which over nearly 50 years was never disappointed. Sometimes I had to understand things differently. I had to often change my concepts because my concepts were not big enough for what was happening. Specifically, I came to understand that my view of reality was like, I was briefly involved in the making of one movie. We made a movie about Ananda, and so I got to see the movie-making process. This much is within the camera's range, and a foot away from it, there's a guy holding a microphone. It's just like, what's going on right outside that frame? This whole crowd of people standing here watching, commenting on things like this. Just so much goes on, and all that shows is the screen. And that it's now just even my little experience has changed my understanding of all of that. But I would see that, and I would see something would enter my field of vision here, my field of understanding, and it would exit here. And I'm a bright girl, so I could draw connections that were not invalid. And so I would form an opinion from here to here, from this edge to this edge. And that opinion was often quite different than the opinion that Swami Kriyananda would have, because I realized he was way over here, and he saw this whole energy coming to this point. He saw it pass through here, and then he saw where it was going. And of course, if you think like that, things that seem inexplicable, wrong, why are they doing that? Why did this happen to me? Sudden changes, death itself. It seems like it comes from nowhere, but it doesn't. It's a long karmic trajectory, and this has to happen because this is where we're going. But our picture is ease and pleasure. And anything that breaks that, we fight against it. But the real drama is enlightenment. The real drama is perfect happiness and perfect freedom. And the good news is We have a loving God. A divine mother is how I like to think of her. We have a loving mother who is determined that we grow up strong. Have you ever been annoyed with when you were a child? One of my friends, when she heard me, she actually heard me talk about, let me think how it went. Paramahansa Yogananda says when a child is conceived, when the sperm and ovum unite, he said, there's a flash of light in the astral world, and all those souls who are ready to incarnate rush, who are in tune with that light, who are in tune with that vibration, will rush to try to get into the womb. And he said sometimes two will get in at the same time. That's how he puts it. And that's the picture. And I think it's not as random as that. That just sounds, like a game of musical chairs or something. But that the image is a very interesting one like that. So my friend heard me say this. And then she came to tell me that her son, who was by that time college age, when he was about 4 or 5, maybe 5 years old, she disciplined him for something, and he did not like being disciplined. And he said, like children do, who can be so unkind, "I hate you, you're a terrible mommy." He said like that, and then he walked away, and he decided that wasn't sufficient. So he came back and he said, "You weren't even my first choice." And at that time, she had no context for that. But she was very interested. She said, "Well, honey, who was your first choice?" And he answered her very exactly, "A woman in the Philippines, but she was taken." So years later, she hears me say that souls will rush in, and only some will get in. And she said it was so perfect because her son had a characteristic that she knew very well by then, which is he would get really excited about doing something. He would take about 3 steps toward it, then he would stop and think as to whether to do it. And she could see him heading for the Philippines, then stopping to think about it. And then by the time he decided to go, the womb was taken. Now, I know the actual validity of that whole, what Yogananda says about conception and the soul and all of that part I know. Whether her son was just, who knows what she was doing. But the point here is this. Who we call ourselves is a very temporary identity on one level, and who we really are is running a very glorious tale. But the point of it, our Divine Mother doesn't care whether it's easy and comfortable. Our Divine Mother has a responsibility, just like a human mother does, to stand for a higher truth and to present to her children, which is all of us, the right opportunities for us to become who we're destined to be. And a mother who won't discipline or guide her child because she, doesn't want the child to cry or she doesn't want the child to get upset, that you're not doing a service to your child when you don't raise them to be strong, hard as it is. And so our Divine Mother, our masters, that's how they feel about us. I know, trust me. That's what they're always saying, whether they're saying it in words or not. Trust me. I have a perspective. I know where you're going. I know what you need. There was a little girl in our Ananda community, and her mother, her family, they were very spiritually minded, and they helped the children by telling them lots of stories. And the daughter particularly liked stories about children, especially, there's a lot of stories of children who have visions of Mother Mary. Beautiful stories, Fatima, Garabandal, Lourdes, wonderful, wonderful stories. So this little girl, she was about 6, and she told her mother she wasn't going to school anymore. This was a friend of mine. She wasn't going to go to school anymore because her goal in life was to have a vision of Mother Mary. And it seemed that the people who usually got those were sheep herders. So she wanted to be a sheep herder. So she wanted her mother to arrange for her to be a sheep herder at that point. It was a very logical deduction given her values. But it's also, children illustrate for us what is our deepest purpose for ourselves and for the people we love. And unfortunately, hard times are often the making of us. And that's extremely annoying. But it is a fact. Again, going back to India, for about 20 years, every year or two, I, with some friends, we would lead a pilgrimage tour of India. I'm actually a terrible traveler. I can't, because I've always been taken care of, but I can still move around and be comfortable. So for 20 years, we had tour guides, and I got really good at this particular route like this. And we'd take about 30 people, mostly devotees, but not all. Almost always, they had never been to India before, because this was earlier in the 80s and the 90s when people didn't travel quite as easily, and India was more complicated. It was very interesting to me because people had very different responses to the sight of poverty, beggars, illness, and so on like that. And then you saw a lot more of it. Very different. Some people were perfectly at ease. They could just be with, begging children and just laugh and play with them and have a wonderful time. Other people were totally freaked out. And I was in the role of trying to keep everybody sane while we were on this trip and happy. And I began to understand that people's reaction to other people's suffering was actually quite predictable. And this was the metric. If you had come to understand that suffering was a great teacher and that it was a gift from God to suffer because of what you could learn, then when you see other people suffering, that's how you would think about it. It's not that I want them to suffer, but why would I not want them to grow? You see? That's the prejudice. Ease and pleasure is good. Somebody's struggling, but that struggle is going to give them the opportunity to grow. Would I not want them to grow? Do I want my child to be a baby forever? My friend was trying to potty train her little boy, and she tried something that sometimes works, and had worked with her firstborn. Don't you want to be a big boy? She said, no, Mommy, I love being a baby. But eventually he had to be potty trained. I said, no one's ever gone to college in diapers. He'll be fine. We'll sort this out before too long. But why would you want someone to be a baby forever? Why would you yourself want to be a baby forever? So, this puts us in a very challenging position, doesn't it? Because it just breaks. You see, this is the age of energy versus the age of form. Now, that doesn't mean we don't help. We do everything we can to help, because that's how we grow. When we inconvenience ourselves for the welfare of others, when we actually find our joy in the welfare of others, that's what Divine Mother wants of us. So this is where we are right now. And how can we best help? We have to go to the causal. We have to find new ideas. And the more powerfully we can live those ideas, the more powerfully we can give them to others. Isn't that so? So I feel every time I'm in a room of people where I can talk like this, it doesn't serve. Swamiji never... At times, Swami said quite remarkable things about Master's teachings, about self-realization, about the new age, about hope for a better world, all of this. But when asked directly, what's the purpose of Ananda, he said, to have fun. Meaning that's how you really help the most, is if you're joy. Joy is what's most attractive. And then he said, but we have to understand what we think of as fun. What we think of as fun is feeling Divine Mother's presence and sharing her with all. It's not debauchery. It's helping people experience what will give us true happiness, and then living by that. I would like to just open it up for more focus by your questions for the next half hour or so. So who likes to go first? There you go, Tanya.
I'd just like to know, when would you know your lesson has been learned?
When do you know when a lesson has been learned? That's a very good question. I'm going to give you a slightly complicated image which will help. We tend to think very linear in this world. We tend to think, I'm standing here and then I'm standing here. This is all the way we think in the material world with form. So we tend to think, I haven't learned a lesson, now I've learned it, like this. Now it's behind me. if you start thinking about meditation and Kriya Yoga and Kundalini and the chakras, all the energy moving up the spine, coming closer to attunement with the divine, being farther away from that. And when we think of raising our energy, I'm going in a spiral because the Kundalini rises in a spiral like this. We still have this idea, this is a lower chakra, this is a higher chakra, and we imagine that delusion and increasing enlightenment is like little cookies stacked up one upon the other like this. So this is a bad cookie, and then I pass it, then this is a better cookie, this is a better cookie, better cookie, better cookie, like this. So that leads us to think, I've learned it, like that. Now, this is what I call the gospel according to Asha. I just made this up because it helps me to understand this. This is not orthodox to anybody. I think that instead of being little round cookies like this, our karma, karma is another word for unlearned lessons. It's something I don't know about eternal happiness and what causes suffering. Karma is an unlearned lesson. So the karma is actually vertical. If we just think of the spine as a tube, the stripes are vertical. But they're not even stripes. Some of them are really fat, and then the same stripe will get really skinny, 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 and you think it's gone, then it'll burst out into a big bubble again, then it'll get small, and maybe eventually it'll disappear. But it may just go underground for a while and then pop out again. So if you were just thinking about your karma, everything you have to learn, as vertical stripes in your inner spine, and the Kundalini actually goes in a circle. So let's think about a spiral staircase like this, and here's the spine, and we're just going around and around and around like this, right? But we're gradually going up, but we're passing stripe after stripe. So we go through a big stripe of jealousy. Let's say it's green. Jealousy, 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 and then all of a sudden we get out of the green stripe. And now we're in a pink stripe of universal love, like this. And then bang, we hit a black stripe of death, disease, and suffering. And we go through a black stripe, and then all of a sudden it's a yellow stripe. But we're just going like this all the way. And each time we come around again, it's a different part of the stripe. And let's just say we're elevating. It's a more subtle aspect of the lesson. But we do have the impression that something has ended. And it has ended because we are ascending, but that doesn't mean we're never going to see it again. So first half of the question is, it always makes me nervous when somebody says to me, well, I learned that. I think, well, please don't say that. What you're saying is, I learned something. I definitely learned something. But to declare that I'm free just fixes a form that will have to be broken later, because you may have mastered everything that you were capable of learning at that point, which is what was presented to you. So it's not like you can't claim a victory, but to say that you've learned everything that will teach you just sets you up not only for lots of things, but for massive disappointment when you come around the circle and there the stupid stripe appears again. I remember in a circumstance in my life, I had this very difficult karma with this other friend. She really was a friend, but we just didn't get along. That's putting it very mildly. But circumstances changed, and what really happened was I didn't have to see her that much. And when her personality was less present, I was able to relate more to her spirit and her soul. And I decided that I loved her and she was wonderful. Then an opportunity came when we were traveling, and I felt so free and so happy that come and share the apartment that I'm staying in. And it took me about 6 minutes before I remembered how much I loathed her and why. That's how I learned these things. And Swami Kriyananda was there, and I was just weeping. I was so disappointed. I had claimed the victory, and I really thought I had it. His response was very casual. Well, he said, you thought the karma was done, so you weren't putting out any energy, and it looks like there's a lot more for you to work on, isn't there? He said, now you know. Which I did not take it as lightly as that. But I realized, I thought I was free because as long as I didn't have to see her too much, I really loved her. But of course, as soon as I saw her, I didn't. I mean, that was not very subtle, but I had not been able to pick all that up. So I've seen many, many times that I do grow. I get higher into it, and then, oh, now we're ready for a more subtle level of this. You know, a more challenging moment, a more deeply held attitude, the implications of this attitude for other things. So that's part of it. That's how I was extrapolating. But you asked the question, how can you tell when karma is done? Swamiji's answer to that, and then now I'm out of my creations. He said, when you're not afraid of it anymore. You know that karma is done when you're not afraid of it anymore. Anything that you still fear is something that you still have to learn. Now, I want to add at this point, the law of karma is really tough. Because if karma exists, in other words, if everything that happens to us is cause and effect, because we put in certain causes and this is the effect of it, if it's true anywhere, it's true everywhere. And I think that's really tough. You know, that means the people you see suffering are not being unfairly treated. That means when something happens to you that seems completely unfair, it's not fair. It is fair. It's cause and effect. You just don't remember the causes. It's our loving mother helping us to see the consequences, the fruit of the tree. So when you say, if you're not afraid of it, you still have karma, because I was Jewish and I was born in 1947, the concept of being in a concentration camp has always been kind of like a part of my life. I didn't even know that everybody in the world didn't worry about going into a concentration camp. I finally said it to a friend of mine, and they said, you know what? I never think about it. And to my mind, for many years, it just like everything was measured against eventually being rounded up and sent to a concentration camp. Does it frighten me? Absolutely. You know, does that mean I'm going to have to live through it? I hope not. But does that mean in some way I'm going to have to stop being afraid of that circumstance? Yes, because that fear, you know, is part of me. I got over the fear in this way. I have a friend, and I was confessing to her about all of this recently, very recently. She said, you're 76 years old, you're living in California, you're part of Ananda. Like, statistically, what are the chances of your going into a concentration camp? And that helped. But then she added the last part. She said, besides, they just kill you. They wouldn't imprison you. You're too old to be useful. Which caused both of us, I started laughing so hard we had to sit on the curb. We were taking a walk. But oddly, it actually did a great deal to dissipate the fear. Just, you know, somehow I was ready to not worry as much as, does that mean, I don't know what would happen. But it's just like, I take it very seriously. If you're still afraid of it, there's still something for you to learn. So that also is very humbling, because there's lots of things we're still afraid of. And I have a living example. Swami Kriyananda was not afraid of anything. He just wasn't. His faith in God was very deep. His stoicism was very strong. His sense of, nothing lasts forever anyway. He had a dream toward the end of his life that he told us about, in which his enemies had decided to burn him at the stake. And he had certain people in his life, all through his life, who did not wish him well. So the people in the dream had faces, you know, and he knew who they were. And they decided that burning him at the stake was really a good thing to just sort of solve the whole problem. And he said, in the way dreams are, he said, the people who were burning him at the stake were over here having dinner, and he was burning at the stake over there. Every so often they'd look over to see how it was going. But he said, you know, he was there, and he said, this is why he told it to us. Because, of course, your subconscious is active in your sleep, and you can't filter it with your conscious opinions. But he said he was completely calm. And he thought, you know, being burned at the stake, it's not a pleasant experience, but it's short, relatively speaking. You know, it'll be unpleasant for a while, and then I'll just be dead. And in the astral world, you don't have a body, and it's just not a problem. And so he was there, and the flames were coming, and it was beginning to start. And then friends came in, and they rescued him and took him away, and so he didn't have to burn. And he said his own response to the situation was exactly the same when he was going to be burned at the stake and when they rescued him. It wasn't, oh, thank you, I'm so glad you came. He said, it was just, okay, now I won't be burned, and they just took him away. I mean, that was just a dream, but he presented it to us. But I saw him behave that way. But it comes of itself, let it come. Now, that's the fruit of everything that we're all doing right now. You know, same story, just a little farther down the road, few closer to the end of the book, you know, more and more in the middle. But that's how you can tell. Now, you can also then be less afraid, and therefore you've learned something. I'm less afraid of being in a concentration camp than I used to be. Am I totally fearless? No, but I'm much less afraid. And not merely because I'm old, okay, and useless. Is there enough? Good question. Is there another one? Yes.
So the story you told us about Swamiji.
You'll have to speak up just a little.
The story you told us about Swamiji in his dream. This was years of discipleship to Master. So how can we sort of develop the same attitude?
When I speak of Swami Kriyananda, I'm speaking of years of discipleship. How can we develop the same attitude? Is that the question? By not quitting. Seriously. It's the first attitude for discipleship. Swamiji wrote a course in how to be a disciple back when he was training monks, you know, in his 20s. And these are the essential attitudes for discipleship. I have this course online somewhere. I'll have to think about where it is. The first attitude is courage. And it always surprised me. I mean, I've grown used to it because I've studied that course a lot. I mean, you would think devotion, love of God, you know, aspiration, selflessness. And the first attitude is courage. Because without courage, none of the rest of it will happen. I mean, courage is everything. The first time life gives you, or the second or the third or the 12th time, it gives you an unexpected, awful blow, what do? Do you just curl up and just wait for this incarnation to be over? I had an experience with my own father. I was sharing this with some of you the other day. And, my mother had Parkinson's for 15 years, and it was a pretty tough, that's a very tough road. And in the last 2 years of her life, my father just took a little mental holiday. He didn't have severe dementia, but he just kind of had enough. But somewhere in there, I was urging him, in the midst of all that, I was urging him to do something that he didn't want to do. And I said, don't you want to grow? He said, no, no. And he basically said, you know, this has been too hard, or this has been hard enough. And then soon after that, he just let his mind go. But he was very courageous for a long time. I don't want to denigrate my dad, but just that, saying that, no, I don't want to grow. I just want out. You look at most older people, not all, but many, many older people. I don't know when they quit, but they quit early on. And they're just marking the time until they can get out of this body with the wrong thought that dying will do something helpful. You know, dying won't do anything helpful. You just, whatever consciousness you have, you just carry it on. It's the rest of the story. But people have the illusion, because they don't understand, that something that they'll get to. It's a shortcut, that death is a shortcut. But death is not a shortcut, it's just the road that you take. So now to come back to this, you have to convince yourself that there's absolutely no alternative except to persevere. Because if any part of you thinks that there's another better way than just persevering with the truth and bringing yourself into alignment with it, you'll always be trying to duck off like this. You know, reincarnation for me has become such an integral part of the way I think. On one hand, I find reincarnation extremely relaxing, Because if I mess up now, I'll get another chance. And if it seems too hard for me and I can't really quite do it, I'll just do what I can. But, you know, I'll get a chance to do it. But it also means that there really is no future, because it will just be now. I mean, now is the future from the past, and there'll be another now that is the present from this moment. And the requirement for me to face whatever I have to face will be exactly the same. And so what is the point? There was a man who did, he did workshops for people who had terminal diagnosis. And they would work with facing their own death, because they all knew that their death was going to be coming, because they had something that couldn't be cured. And the first exercise was you made a list of everything that you were going to miss out on because your life was going to end before you wanted it to. You know, I won't walk my daughter down the aisle. You know, I'll never hold my grandchild. I'll never get to travel to South Africa. You know, whatever it might be. Okay, and people thought, you know, and people would weep and would be very emotional while they faced all that. And you would think that's what they were supposed to be dealing with. Second list was everything you're not going to have to deal with because you're just going to die, right? You know, I'll never actually have to file for bankruptcy. It'll be somebody else's problem, right? You know, I'll finally get away from my nagging wife, you know, whatever it might be, all the things that you get to avoid. And that was really the issue. That was the bigger issue, which is that I think I'm going to gain something by just escaping from this physical body. Because that's the delusion that really holds you. And as a devotee and as a disciple, that's the one you have to get over. You know, it's always going to be now, and this is going to have to be faced. And if it has to be faced, let me just do it now. Let me have the courage to face it now. Now, I use reincarnation as saying, all right, Divine Mother, guess what? I don't have the courage to face it right now, or I don't have the energy. So we're going to just kind of take a pass, but I never honestly believe that that's going to get me anything. I mean, I say it sort of half as a joke, but actually I have to take that back. No, I don't say it at all anymore. I just say, if this is what has to be faced, let's just do it. And see, Swami was like that. Swami was not afraid of anything because his single commitment to what was the truth. Period. So if this is true, if this is my karma, this is true, why would I shirk it? That's where the word courage comes from. What I meant by taking a holiday is that you also have to be realistic, you know. If I need to be not afraid of going to a concentration camp, I'm not going to go walk into one. You know, I'll wait till it comes to me. So that's what I mean about being realistic. And you don't have to go seeking troubles. Just what comes of itself, let it come, and face it bravely. Yeah, good question. Any other? Yes, Lori.
It's a little bit complicated, so I'll try and simplify it. But when you're on a spiritual journey,
Mm-hmm.
you know, you find that you start on your spiritual journey and you get really excited and you think, well, this is where I'm going and I'm really dedicated to this path and I'm going to stick to it. And then, you know, you get a thorn in your side and then what happens is that you're on this trajectory and you're on your path and then...
The question is, when life does things that you didn't plan for, that are very hard to take, how do you keep your faith? How do you keep your energy up? How do you keep your courage up? It's one thing to say you need it, it's quite another to do it. People work on this from many different angles. Devotion is very helpful. Just having cultivated experiences in your heart through meditation, through music, through chanting, through being out in nature, just everything that you can think of that brings back to the surface why you're on the spiritual path at all. So cultivating positive experience is a huge thing because it gives you money in the bank, so to speak. I remember there was a 12-year period that was very difficult within Ananda. We were subject to litigation, and I was in the middle of all that. And I remember it was 20 years into it for me. I remember sort of saying quietly to someone, thank God I've had other experience than this. If this was my only experience on the path, I would be out of here a long time ago. But I was able to realize that I had had other experiences, and this wasn't the only thing. So that's part of it. You know, keep a gratitude list of everything that's good so you don't lose track. Because I have a jnanic nature, meaning ideas have a lot of power for me, I think it's very helpful to get as clear as you can on the fundamental principles of the path that you're following, such as karma is always fair, right? Such as it's always going to be now, and there is no way out except straight through it. Because if any part of you is fuzzy on the basics and thinks, oh, well, this is really tough, I'll just go do that and it'll be easier. But if you have, when the sun was shining and it was not so difficult, you've studied, you've meditated, you've reflected, and you really know what your choices are. That it's just, this is the only choice. So this may be bad, but everything else is going to be worse, because at least I'm going on this. The other thing is the exact opposite of that. You have to be really nice to yourself. And a lot of times we just set an impossible standard for ourselves. That this is how, a saint would respond, this is how Kriyananda would respond. I'm a failure because I'm not responding like that. So a solid dose of humility is really helpful. And humility is self-honesty, which is I'm good, but I'm not that good. And so I'm not actually going to murder this person, even though I would love to. I was so mad at someone once, I actually understood why people would shoot people. I really did. Fortunately, I've never even held a gun in my hand, but I understood why you would shoot someone. You are such a bummer in my life that if I just kill you, you won't be in my life anymore and things will be better. I mean, I watched the whole form go through my head, but I didn't kill them. I didn't. Yay, victory! I mean, seriously, it's like, don't measure yourself against an impossible standard. I said this yesterday or so, we're in a group. Just do a little better than your worst. And I mean that very seriously. Every day, and this is the same answer to you, not even every day, but just try to do a little better than your worst and claim that as a victory. Be realistic. This is a very long project. And we've built up all kinds of ins and outs, and those karmic bombs just go off. And then all of a sudden you're just in the middle of something that you didn't know was there. And this is where you have to say everything is fair, God is taking care of us, your faith in God, that this is okay. You have to just have all those things. You have to recognize that this is not as easy as it looks at the start. Divine Mother plays with us. It's a big chapter book, our life, right? This incarnation even. And oftentimes you start, and then what happens is the book actually flips towards some really late chapters here, where the hero and the heroine are so happy together and everything has worked out. We're marching into the sunset and the violins are playing. And then all of a sudden the book flips back and you're here and all the adventures, but oftentimes you get a glimpse. But you have to also realize that that is where I'm going, but that's not where I am. And I do not know if this is actually true, but I've been told that Yogananda said, when you have a big test in life, he said, victory is not just marching forward, without any mud on your boots. He said, it's not even crawling on your hands and knees. He says, if you just slither forward, he said, that's enough. I really don't know if he actually said it, but I know that it's true. Yeah, and sometimes I just sit down on the road and think about it. you know, sometimes even lie down on the road and pull the covers up over my head. But I know eventually I'll get up. And so I don't panic. See, that's the advantage of years. I don't panic when I find myself not getting out of bed. You know, I just know that, well, as another friend said, it's not that easy to lay down and die. It's hard. You get hungry, you know. So you've decided to quit, but it's not that easy. But just be nice to yourself. You'll get it right sooner or later. Much of the torment, I'll add one more point to this, bad enough that we don't behave that well, but much worse that we get a complex because we didn't behave that well. This is a problem. This is a real problem. So, yeah. One more. When Ananda used to be so small, Ananda community was like where you are now, where everybody knows everybody. You always know where everybody is. We didn't have cars, so nobody could leave the property, you know. And it's like, and every time there was an event, everybody was there. So there was a Kriya initiation, which was a very important event, and this one man didn't show up. So, you know, we always would be afraid, is he dead in his trailer? You know, like what happened, because we lived at solitary. So he sent me over to see how he was. Very, very good man, still very solid on the path. And I said, Swamiji is worried about you. Why didn't you come to Kriya last night? He said, I just didn't feel like bowing down to the gurus. So he said just like that. Very honest. I went and said, sir, he says, and I said he didn't feel like bowing down to the gurus. Swami said, oh, I understand that. Yeah, just sometimes you feel that way. That was it. Sometimes you feel that way. So if you just accept that as part of it, then it's not so hard. Okay? This is technically our meditation time. So I think that will do us for this morning. Okay?